Bonsuelo, athletes! Today we are going to deal with inequalities. And for the most part, solving an inequality is going to be the same thing as solving an equation. You get rid of fractions, and then you just solve the inequalities if it was an equation, except for one big difference, and I assume you already know this, that you change the direction of the inequality symbol if you multiply or divide both sides of the inequality by a negative. So for instance, the example here, you have negative 2x is less than 5. Since we're dividing by negative 2, we change the direction of the symbol. The next one, 2x is less than negative 5. We're dividing by 2, so even though there's a negative in the problem, we're not dividing by a negative, so you don't change the direction of the symbol. Fine, I assume you know that. Okay, so let's move on. Something that is not an absolute necessity, but something I strongly recommend, is that you read an inequality from the variable. So most people would read this, 5 is greater than x. You may, but the better thing to do would be read it from the variable and read it as x is less than 5. You'll make far fewer mistakes if you read it that way. There's an example of how it would graph. You have an open circle at 5 because that doesn't include the 5, and then x is less than 5. So you make it going to the left. If a lot of people that read this 5 is greater than x would put it going to the right because they would see this as a greater than. Okay, it's 5 is greater than x. Yes, that's true. But really what it's saying is x is less than 5. So I suggest you read it that way. Okay, what am I going to tell you about solving inequalities that's new? Okay, with the exception of a single linear inequality, and I mean exception of a single linear inequality, and I'll tell what that means in a second, you must solve an inequality by graphing. You don't solve and then graph, you solve it by graphing. Okay, now, a single inequality, that should be pretty straightforward. I'm going to scribble some stuff here. You don't need to write it down. That's a single inequality, right? There's one of them, okay? That's pretty straightforward. There is just one of them. What does linear mean? Linear, it's really more complicated than this, but for now, linear just means you have a variable exponent of 1. So for instance, don't write this down, just listen. That is a single, because there's only one inequality, linear, because the variable exponent, x is to the first power, that is a single linear inequality. You do not need to graph this. All you do is subtract the 2, and you'd be done, okay? Now, what if you have this, though? X squared plus 2, and you don't need to write this down, just listen. X squared plus 2 is greater than or equal to 7. Okay, that is a single inequality, but it is not linear. Why isn't it linear? Because the variable is to the second power. So you don't know how to do this. That's okay. We'll discuss it sometime later in the year. I'm just saying for right now, you would have to graph that, okay? Single linear, you don't have to graph. But if it's not that, everything else you basically have to graph. Okay, so for instance, one more example. And again, you don't need to write this down. Again, this one's a little tougher. What you'll find out later is an absolute value will resolve itself into 2 inequalities. Okay? So, and this is a little beyond where we are right now, so don't worry about this one too much. We'll get there eventually. But this will resolve itself into 2 inequalities. So, it is not a single linear inequality. It's something other than just a simple x. It's got a variable inside an absolute value. Anyway, don't worry too much about that one. But this one you would have to graph too. It's not just, just an x. Okay, it's got an absolute value around it. Anyway, again, you don't need to worry about how to do this just yet. I'm just kind of trying to give you an idea of what a single linear inequality is. All right. Now, notation. This is really what I'm going to so that's really about all I have to say about inequalities. what I want to talk about is notation. This doesn't tell you how to do something. It just tells you how to write something or how to express something. Okay, there are two ways to express an inequality. The first one is an inequality symbol, which you should be familiar with. And then the other one's called interval notation, which is what I'm going to talk about because you're probably not familiar with it. Okay, let's take this graph. Okay, the inequality is x is greater than or equal to, sorry about that. So it's greater than or equal to -7. And it's equal to it because that the dot above the 7 is filled in. Okay, well, how do you express an interval? An interval is always expressed smallest to largest. So what's the smallest number on this graph? It's -7. And then you put a comma. What's the largest number on this graph? It's +infinity. Okay? That sideways 8 is the symbol that means infinity. Okay, I'm just going to try and... So that symbol means infinity. It's kind of a sideways 8. Okay, now the thing that this doesn't tell you is, do you include the -7 or not? Okay? And does it include infinity or not? Okay, if you include the number, if the number is part of the graph, you put a bracket. Well, -7 is part of this, so you put a bracket. How about infinity? And this will always be true for infinity. You never include infinity. Why? Because can you reach infinity? No. So if you can't reach it, how can you include it? If you don't include the number on the graph, then it's a parentheses. Okay? So what I want to do is just go through a couple examples, 3 examples here, and just show you how to write them. So let's take a look at another one. Okay, here's the graph. Okay, so what's the inequality? X is less than -7. Fine. Okay, now, what's the interval? Well, the smallest number here is -infinity, and the largest number is -7. Okay, do you include the -infinity? No, so we put a parentheses. You never include infinity or -infinity. And do we include the 7? Well, the 7 here is not included, so we'd put a parentheses for that also. Now, just something I want to mention real briefly, and you don't need to write this part down, but could I write, not that you should, or would, but -7 is greater than x? Does that say the same thing? Yes, it does. So that would be perfectly acceptable. I don't know that I'd really recommend it, but it would be acceptable. Okay, may you write the interval -7 to -infinity? No, you may not. That is not acceptable. An interval always has to be smallest to largest. It's always got to be smallest to largest, okay? Or as you look at it on a number line from left to right. So this thing you cannot do, all right? Well, let's take a look at another example. Let's take a look at an inequality. Okay, here, this is one graph. Notice there aren't 2 parts to it or anything like that. So we're going to write one statement. We're going to say x is greater than or equal to -7, but less than 5. And yes, you must write it as one statement because we're taking a look at one graph. Okay, now what would the interval be? The interval starting at -7 and it ends at 5. It's quite simple. You're just not used to it, that's all. Okay, well, does the graph include -7? Yes, it does. So we put a bracket. Does the graph include the 5? No, it doesn't because there's a hole there. It's empty. So we put a parentheses. One statement, whether it's the inequality or the interval. Okay? And by the way, how do you know whether to put the inequality or the interval? A lot of times the instructions will indicate it. If not, might be optional, but most part, I use an interval. It's just much simpler. And I'm going to require you at some point to write me an inequality. I'm going to require you at some point to write an interval. So you should know how to write both of them. Okay, let's take a look at the inequality here. Now, notice these are 2 separate parts. It's one graph, but it's got 2 separate parts. So you have to write this as 2 separate parts. So what's the first part? X is less than negative 7, or x is greater than or equal to 5. You can't write that as one statement. It has to be written as two separate statements. What would the interval be? Well, you never include infinity, so we're going to put a parentheses, negative infinity to negative 7, and the 7's not part of the graph, so we put another parentheses, and we put this symbol. I'm not going to worry about explaining it, but it means union, it means the same thing as or. And then 5 is part of the graph, so we put a bracket, comma, positive infinity. A lot of people don't put the positive on positive infinity. I like to do it, but it is optional. You have to put the negative on the negative infinity, though. Okay? And then since you don't include infinity, you put a parentheses. Okay, so as far as solving inequalities go, I'm not really telling you anything new here, except for the one thing that I mentioned that's really not affecting what we're doing today. But if you've got a single linear inequality, you don't need to make a graph, unless somehow it tells you you must make a graph. But you don't automatically have to make a graph. But if you have anything else, which we're not going to do now, but eventually we will, you have to make a graph to do it. Okay? And then the other thing is notation. Doesn't tell you how to do something. It just tells you how to write an answer. Okay. Hopefully that is helpful to you, and I shall talk to you later. Have a good day.